Okay, folks, I have to speak up because this is not for you to hear, it's for the recording purposes. Um, this is the soil health workshop, and we're going to have 4 speakers. I'm going to give a brief introduction of all 4 of them, and then they're going to come up one at a time. We're going to lead off with John Mesko, who's the executive director of MOSES, which is the Midwest Organic something education organic and sustainable education service. And then we'll have Jeff Lowenfels, who's the author of Teaming with Microbes and the other teaming books. And then we'll have David Oien, who spoke last night from Timeless Seeds. And then we'll finish up with Jim Riddle, whom you also heard last night from Blue Fruit Farm in Winona.
Thank you, Terry. Try as I might, I wanted to start with that slide. I think they wanted to have my name up there so you could see that. I caught the tail end of David's presentation before coming in here, and I thought it was really fascinating, some of the things that he was sharing. And some of what I have for you is a little bit of a repeat of that. I think it bears repeating. I want to start, though, with a question of what is soil? And what do you think about when you think about soil? A lot of people in the United States and around the world think of soil as the medium upon which we walk, the medium into which we build our buildings or put our sidewalks on, or our roads so we can drive our cars, or our parking lots so we can park our cars. And to many in the agricultural community, soil is a temporary placeholder for seed and fertility and soil amendments and pesticides. And the idea is let's use this almost like a petri dish to hold the seed, put some fertilizer in there. Let's hope that it sticks around long enough to fertilize the crop and grow a bountiful harvest. And that's kind of conventional agriculture. A lot of people won't describe it that way, but that is really what the way soil is being treated in that system for the most part. And what I'd like to encourage you to think about as you put in your mind what soil health is and what we mean by soil health is to think about the outcomes and to think about soil as a biological system. Soil is alive. Soil is much more than just a static medium or something that we use to live on. It is a protective covering around the earth, and it's alive. As you heard in the presentation just prior, it's full of all kinds of bacteria, beneficial insects, fungi, and so forth. And the function of soil, or soil health, is really defined as its functionability, or its capacity to process nutrients, organic matter, moisture, and to provide a living, breathing, healthy environment for plants to grow. Did anybody in here grow up caring for livestock or working with livestock at all in any way? Okay, great. You probably, by definition of that, understand what I'm about to tell you, and that is that the outcome of soil health is very evident in livestock. And the value, you can fake it by putting on some fertilizer and making your plants look healthy. But it's much more difficult to fake healthy animals. And anybody who raises livestock will tell you this. If you are, whether it's an organic farm or a conventional livestock farm, if they have a high veterinary bill, that's a problem. And the problem is not just with the animals. It's probably in the soil. This field that these cattle are grazing on was a cornfield about 8 years ago. Nothing was done to the cornfield other than bringing cattle out in rotation. No seeds were planted, no fertilizer was applied. The corn was harvested, and then the cattle and sheep were occasionally put out there as well. To the eye of somebody who's been around livestock, you can probably identify some very positive things here. These two calves that are the focus of this picture is really the outcome that somebody who's focusing on soil health is going to get from their farm. If you think about it, those calves were probably a week or two old in that picture. On the day they were born, they were the product of the soil. Nothing's been put on the soil. The cow ate the grass. She became pregnant and produced the calf, all out of what came from the grass. And where'd the grass come from? All from the soil. So the fact that there's baby calves running around and nothing was put onto the soil, where did the 80 pounds of flesh and bone and hair for each of those calves come from? It came from a healthy soil. Nothing was added to this at all. This picture isn't showing up as well, but this is the same situation, a different field, the same situation. The crop was corn about 8 years ago, nothing done to it, no seeds applied, no fertilizer applied, no tillage, just livestock. Livestock grazing in rotation, both sheep and cattle. Here again, calves that are smaller than, the grass is taller than the calves at this point. There's somebody that you probably have heard of if you've talked about soil health at all, and that's a gentleman named Gabe Brown who farms near Bismarck, North Dakota. This is another example of how the outcome of soil health can be found in, at least initially, the livestock. This picture was taken in 2013. It was August. I was there on the farm that day. It was 100 degrees that day at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. In Bismarck, North Dakota, that was a record. It doesn't get that warm very often. This is a field of cover crops. There's 30 different species of cover crops that are planted in this field. What you see that's tall there is sorghum sudan grass. And that's pretty normal for it to get tall. But what you really may not be able to see at the bottom here because of the screen is that this was planted 7 weeks before this picture was taken. And in the time between planting and this picture, less than a ½ inch of rain fell on that soil. Now these are Angus cattle. I won't bore you with the details between Angus and the previous cattle, but they have black hides. And when it's 100 degrees and sunny, animals that have black hair don't, well, all animals, but in particular, animals with black hair really don't like to be out in the sunshine. 100 degrees, I'm the one who took the picture. I have never seen cattle more excited to be out in the middle of the hot sun in a pasture like that. So to a livestock producer, this means a lot. When you're growing livestock, what do you want them to do? You want them to eat. You don't want them to be in the shade at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. You want them to eat. And they came out and they ate and they were thrilled. Now, this is a product of soil health. The reason they could even stand to be out there was that the soil was healthy, meaning it was processing and facilitating the exchange of water and nutrients and organic matter. And so the soil temperature, even though the air was 100, the soil temperature was much less, probably in the low 80s that day. Gabe is a bit of a mentor for many folks, and he refers to this as biological primification, focusing on feeding the microbes in the soil and letting that be the productive capacity that builds, and from that, increasing the function of that soil, the water holding capacity, the nutrient holding capacity, the natural biological function of breaking down organic matter into nutrients and having them available for livestock growth. Feeding the biology that sustains life. And I would give Gabe credit for this photo as well. It starts with the soil as a protective covering over the earth, a live protective covering that is part of a natural ecosystem, just like the atmosphere, just like rivers and streams, just like forests. everything involved in the soil is part of what the earth is doing to sustain its own life. And so with soil, healthy soil leads to healthy plants, animals, healthy people, and a healthy world. A focus on soil health starts with the elimination of pesticides. There's no question about it. You can't put things on the soil that kill stuff and have much soil life, right? But just like our own bodies, I think we probably all agree, if there's a nutritionist in the room, you probably would say you should eliminate sugar from your diet. Yes, you should eliminate sugar from your diet. But if that's all you did, you might be giving up some potential health in your body. You might want to add a walk or two every now and then. You might want to add some vegetables and some fiber to your diet. You might want to mix in some fresh air into your life. So what I want to tell you is that we're at a starting point when we eliminate pesticides. Organic, sustainable agriculture is a focus on soil health. And the starting point, as I said, is to eliminate pesticides. That's a picture that, for me personally, is what farming should be all about. It should be about working with nature in a way that produces healthy soil, that makes it so that that soil will sustain indefinitely without adding things to it. And the outcomes are the things that we should be focusing on, not just in terms of yield, but in terms of health. Thank you. I don't know who's next. Okay.
Jeff is up next, but I just want to let you know that we're going to have about half hour, I think. We're going to have some time for asking questions at the end.
So, what do we do?
We let Drew come up here.
So I normally give a talk. Yes, please. While he's fixing that, I normally give a talk that starts out with what the soil food web is, and then I talk about how to fix the soil food web. Today I'm going to start ask backwards how to fix the soil food web, and then my keynote later on is what the soil food web is. But you heard a pretty good example, yeah. And so my last slide in what was supposed to be the talk that was supposed to come before this one is you got a problem, how do you fix it? Well, you fix it by putting the microbes back into, enter, is that what I do? Okay, down and up. Okay, you put the microbes back in the soil that you've destroyed by using pesticides. Later on, this will all come together. But there are 4 ways that you can restore soil that's been ruined by herbicides and pesticides. And the first way is to use compost. Compost teas, which are made out of compost, mulches, different kinds of mulches, and mycorrhizal fungi in the proper situation. So let's just quickly go through these. I've got a trilogy out, just like we heard before. I like to call myself Lord of the Roots now. And of course, there's these 4 different ways that you can fix the soil, but there's 3 books that'll tell you how to do it. And the first one is Teaming with Microbes, which is guaranteed. You buy that book and don't like it, I buy it back at 3 times the price. All right, anyway, compost. Compost has in it all of the fertilizer bags, the fungi and the bacteria that are at the bottom of the soil food web that get eaten by the fertilizer spreaders, the protozoa and the nematodes, who poop out the excess that contains all of those nutrients that feed the plant. Compost has everything in it that you possibly need. This is why people love compost. This is why compost is the #1 recommendation for making your soils clean and organic again. You don't need a lot of compost, and you don't need to rototill it into the system. You can put that compost on the surface. The microbiology and the arthropods, et cetera, and worms will bring the compost down into the soil within about 6 or 8 months, and if not the compost itself, the microbes from the compost. So you don't really need to mix it in. There are a couple of problems with compost. First of all, you have to have a spouse that's willing to turn your compost pile. And second of all, you got to know where your compost comes from. Even though a lot of compost is shitty, some of it is really, really shitty. And so you got to know where it comes from, and you got to know what's in it. because if you use the wrong stuff to make your compost, like chlorofluorolus, which I can't pronounce, and it ends up not being fully composted, and you put it down on your grass, your trees die, or your vegetables die, or you have tetracycline in it because the neighbor that you got your manure from, was feeding tetracycline and wasn't composted properly, and the tetracycline gets on the plant, and you get somebody that's allergic to tetracycline and gets sick. So you have to know where your compost comes from. And the thing about compost, it's great in the soil, but it can also stick to leaves if you make a tea out of it. So people have learned how to make compost teas. There are also two kinds of compost. One kind of compost fosters bacterial life, and the other kind of compost fosters fungal life. And as I will explain later on, plants like one of two kinds of nitrogen made by either of those two organisms, and so you want to get the right kind, and so you can stylize your compost for what you're growing. A little complicated, but it's all in this easy-to-read book. Compost teas stick to the surface of the leaves and the plant. And when they stick to the surface, they put the microbiology on the surface. It's called the phyllosphere, that little area around the leaf. And they outcompete the bad guys for space and nutrients and the entryway into the plant. They can clog up a stomata. So compost teas have become very effective, and you can make a compost tea that's bacterially dominated or fungally dominated, depending on what kind of plant you need to have it eat. And they're very easy to make. You can buy them, and if you want to go into a great business, making compost tea is a terrific thing. You can make your own using compost tea brewers. The one I like is called the KISS brewer, K-I-S. You can take a look at it. But compost tea brewers are phenomenal, and it's neat stuff. And if you don't want to do a compost tea brewer, you can take your compost and squeeze it over 15, 20 minutes in water, and you pull out a lot of the microbes that are in it. When you make a compost tea, over a 24-hour period, you not only pull out the microbes, but you breed them so that when you put it down on the soil or on your plant, it's got tremendous microbiology in it. Compost tea is controversial. The Cooperative Extension Service says it doesn't work. These are before and after pictures. This is South Africa. This is Dr. Elaine's old office, Dr. Elaine Ingham, no compost tea. This is the shed aquarium. These are potatoes, and here are some of my favorite pictures. This is John Evans, who has about 14 or 15 Guinness Book of Records. He uses compost and compost tea only in his gardens in Alaska. This is a 27-pound leek. I bring this picture to show you this zucchini over here, which was 49 pounds. And I took it down to the flower show in Seattle from Alaska, and because Alaska Airlines only allows 50 pounds, I had to have it in a separate suitcase, and when I opened it up, there was a little card from the TSA, you know, the thing you've always seen that thing, and stapled to it was a little note that said, "Holy shit." It's just all compost and compost tea. This is the president of Harvard University looking at their first compost tea brewer. When you park your car in Harvard Yard, you are parking your car on a yard that's been compost teed. It was so successful that now Harvard composts everything they possibly can, the exam books, all of their food, some of the dead professors. But the Cooperative Extension Service says it doesn't work. Go tell the president of Harvard University. What falls down from a plant's supposed to be down there. This is mulch. This is how plants feed themselves. It's called a law of return. We're farmers and gardeners, and we take stuff out of the garden and out of the farm, and we break the law of return. So we have to put that stuff back down there. But my God, what does fall down there we don't take, leave it there. Don't rake it up. There are different kinds of mulches. Mulches will breed bacteria and fungi. If they're green mulches, they have tremendous amounts of sugar on them, which bacteria like. And if they're brown mulches, that's what the fungi like. Green for things that are in the ground for less than a year. Brown for things that are in the ground for more than a year. And then you get the right kind of nitrogen for your plants. Those are the soil food web rules. And this is the difference between using mulch and not using mulch. Unbelievable difference. You get much better root development, obviously. And ectomycorrhizal fungi. This is something that has just started to come into a fore. When I wrote the book, original book, it had a paragraph on mycorrhizal fungi. I revised the book and had to put a whole chapter in it. Finally, I just had to do a whole book, which just came out in January. There are two that we care about as gardeners and farmers, ectomycorrhizal and endomycorrhizal. The ectomycorrhizal are visible. You can see them. They have fruiting bodies that you can see, mushrooms, et cetera, and they form these coatings around the roots, and they go out and they get nutrients, and they bring it back to the plant, and the plant gives them exudates, so everybody's happy. It's a nice symbiotic relationship. So if you see mushrooms around a tree, those are the fruiting bodies of the mycorrhizal fungi, and that's what these are here, just so that there's some more there. These are not mycorrhizal fungi around that little post there. So they're not all mushrooms are mycorrhizal fungi. The endomycorrhizal fungi are invisible. You have to stain them. And incidentally, 96% of all plants have a mycorrhizal association. So these are in all sorts of plants. So you have to stain them to be able to see them. They have these wonderful structures that are called arborescal, and then they have these little round things that are vesicles that hold water. There's one of the vesicles, so that these hold water, and this is where the nutrient transfer can take place between the plant and the fungi. They're absolutely spectacular. This is one of those tree-like structures, and they form these beautiful structures that invade the root, infect the root, and go out and get food in return for those wonderful exudates. And we're just beginning to learn a lot about them. What happens with a plant is it goes in, it takes up all the nutrients in the zone near the root. That's the exclusion zone. And then it has a choice. If it wants to feed more, it can, a lot of energy, grow deep and go down, or it can associate with mycorrhizal fungi with a little bit of exudates. They are teeny, and they go out far, far away from the root and the exclusion zone and bring back all manner of great nutrients for the plant. So it's really a terrific thing. And so if you have two plants sitting in the sun and one of them says, geez, you know, I'd really like some bologna, what it does is it goes and mixes the exudate, because the plant can change the exudate to get what it wants, and then it puts the exudate out into the soil. It catches the fungi, and then the fungi goes into the plant, and the other half of the fungi goes out to get the bologna. And sure enough, what does it do? Wait for it. It gets the bologna. I had to be, bipartisan on this one. And there it is. So the plant gets the bologna. The fungi brings it back to the plant, and lo and behold, the plant grows as a result of eating all this wonderful food. And what's even cooler is that if you've got two plants next to each other, they share their mycorrhizal fungi. Holy crow. So even if it's a tree and a marigold, they're sharing their foods together. And when that tree dies, all of the nutrients go back into the soil, down into this wonderful network underneath in the soil, not necessarily to feed another tree, but to feed something else in the area that needs to be fed to keep the system working properly. Unbelievable. And they go out and they get all of these wonderful nutrients for these plants. You don't need fertilizer. You need mycorrhizal fungi. In particular, it gets phosphorus. And we're about 40 years from peak phosphorus. So if we don't use these things, we are going to be in deep, deep trouble. Okay, and it gets zinc, iron, calcium, magnesium, water, all sorts of stuff. This is a celery root with a mycorrhizal fungi on it. These are the spores. They are available now. You can buy them. What they do is they cut the roots up, and you get the spores and those little vesicles. Those vesicles will turn into spores, and so they sell those as the mycorrhizal fungi. These little pieces of stuff. You can grow your own, and you can buy your own, and they are incredibly effective. And so why would you care? Well, first of all, you'd care because you use much less fertilizers. Far, far less fertilizer, because the plant is going out and getting its own food for itself. Let's see, do they work? Absolutely. These are before and afters. It's not always a bigger plant. It's sometimes just a healthier plant. They're really easy to use, and they work on every single plant other than the ones your kids don't like to eat because they don't make those associations, so cabbages and that kind of stuff. You get more nitrogen fixation, more nodules, more soybeans. They work phenomenal in drought. So what happens in the drought is those little vesicles, that water goes into the plant, and so things can survive. It prevents runoff because the mycelium created by these guys run through the soil, weave together particles, and hold them together just like a sponge. So you don't get runoff when you have mycorrhizal fungi. And again, they partner with other plants in the area and keep the system healthy. It's a true partnership not only between the fungi and the plant, but between the fungi and all of the plants in the area. If you were a nematode, you'd have a heck of a hard time getting through this white, fluffy mycorrhizal fungi. So they act as a protectant as well. And then they contain this wonderful substance called glomalin. So they drip out this substance out of their system, and this glomalin, which was discovered in 1996, contains about 30 or 40% of the carbon that goes into the soil. Not humic acids, but this glomalin that come from mycorrhizal fungi, because the stuff has a double carbon base on it. We won't get into the science, too complicated, but these glycoproteins put the carbon in the soil. This is where it comes from, mycorrhizal fungi. And so it provides rigidity, this glomalin stuff that goes on, that provides the carbon, and it solidifies the filaments, and it seals gaps, which you can't really see there, but that's okay. Anyway, so you can use these mycorrhizal fungi in absolutely everything. They take the place, in many ways, of fertilizer, which would kill off the soil food web that acts as the protectant, and therefore you end up using pesticides. But if you use the mycorrhizal fungi, you don't have to use the fertilizers, et cetera, in order to be able to do stuff. It's easy to apply this stuff. It comes in powder form now, comes in liquid form now. You can buy them anywhere. So you need to ask yourself when you're fooling around with pesticides how to fix things, who, what, where, when, and how, what's eating, what's the problem. Then you need to figure out how to how to add the soil food web organisms that can fix it, all in the book. You want to consume, you want to outcompete, you want to interfere, you want to reduce the pest numbers, all which can be done with non-pesticides. And then you want to ensure that you have a habitat with great soil that will support beneficial organisms, so you never have to use pesticides again. Let's see, almost done. Yeah, so if you don't believe any of this stuff, I always leave people with this one thought. Think about those redwood trees. They're 500 years old, 370, 50 feet tall. They've been there forever. They are gigantic. How'd they get that way without anybody ever using a pesticide or Miracle-Gro? They teamed up with the soil food web, and if they can do that, we should too, because that's the answer. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. And if half of this didn't make sense, maybe after lunch the other half will. Thank you very much.
I don't know about you, but I'm going to buy all 3 of those books. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Okay, I'm David Oien, a organic farmer from north central Montana. Moved back to the farm in 1976, and I've been trying to make a living doing that and other things ever since. But let me give a little bit of a context here. A little bit of a proviso, I guess. This is where we are currently, Minneapolis. This is where I come from. And what this means is that if I told you about kind of what we do, when we do it, and how we do it, it really wouldn't make too much sense. I mean, it wouldn't be the take-home message that you could go home and do the same thing. There are bioregions separating us, even from Montana to Minneapolis. I know many of you from other places around the country, whether it's Hawaii or North Carolina or Florida, wherever it is. So what I'm going to talk about are not really the specifics, not the practices per se, not what equipment we use, but a little bit more the general principles. Jeff talked an awful lot about soil organisms. I'm a farmer, so I kind of take things from a step or two back, I guess, in many ways. So in the 40 years, I guess, since I've been back to the farm, working with soil health, trying to restore soil health, there's 3 kind of general lessons, I guess, that I'd like to share. One is that biodiversity builds builds resilience, except when it doesn't. What that means is that at a very practical level on a farm, sometimes we try things that kind of just don't work and have negative financial impact, sometimes negative production impact. Also, it's impossible to do just one thing, which David Montgomery talked on a little bit, but just an example of this. Sometimes a person might plant, a cover crop to build soil. That cover crop takes moisture. That might be detrimental to the following crop. And so it can work both ways. There are both intended and unintended consequences for whatever you do in trying to improve soil health. Third lesson is what you don't see is what you get. Right? Yeah. Okay, this is kind of the general landscape of where I come from. The short grass prairies in north central and kind of eastern Montana. Basically, soils developed there over the past 10,000 years or more after that 100 feet of glacier that Dave Montgomery talked about receded, and the geology that was there was gradually joined by plant and animal life. At that time, my grandparents moved to Montana about 100 years ago, immigrated from Norway, and this is pretty much what they saw. There was a high diversity of plants and animals. This picture does not include buffalo. I just couldn't capture the 10,000 buffalo that happened to pass there, I guess, but I was, 200, 300 years too late to do that. But anyway, very high diversity, pretty much complete plant cover, very limited soil disturbance, except when those buffalo pass through and other ungulates. It's also it's a semi-arid environment, so we have very low rainfall. And the prairie agriculture, or the prairie landscape had evolved to adapt to that. And that's still what we need to deal with from the agricultural side, is the fact that we get very little rainfall in that area, which definitely gives us some limitations and also some opportunities. It's also a very short growing season. Okay, so basically in the past 100 years, we've changed that landscape considerably, and that's been with increasing mechanization, monocropping in our area. That's been cereal grains, kind of fence line to fence line, and from farm to farm. Has been primarily wheat, in some cases barley. We've had to use increasing off-farm inputs, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and so forth. As we simplify that biological system, there has to be kind of, or at least was, increasing off-farm imports in order to make up for what we had been taking away through either synthetics or through mechanization. And all that really ended up with creating decreased soil health, and all these things are kind of interrelated. The less soil health you have, the more off-farm inputs you kind of need to produce an economically viable crop. So when I moved back from in 1976, came back with Rachel Carson's under one arm, and I guess Sir Albert Howard's book under the other arm. So it was all about the soil. As Jeff mentioned, kind of the major tenet of organic farming is healthy soil gives you healthy plants gives you healthy people. So the goal really was to, how do we go from this system, from this simplified system, and kind of incorporate more and more a regenerative system as the native prairies were. And what I want to talk about for the next few minutes is just the addition of diversity, the reintroduction of diversity into the ecology. So one of the ways that we do this in northern Montana, and this, again, the specific crops don't really matter, but we add diversity in time, okay, and that is crop rotations. So we're starting with wheat. So how do we add diversity to that? Well, one of the most simple ways is to not grow wheat after wheat after wheat, but to add different crops. The one that I am kind of most focused on, I guess, and have been for the past 30 years, are edible legumes, peas, lentils, chickpeas, and so forth. The advantage of those legumes is that whereas wheat cannot create its own nitrogen, needs nitrogen input somehow, the legumes can do that biologically rather than require chemical input. Another way to do it is with forage legumes. In other words, legumes that are used for either hay or livestock grazing. And then kind of the third category of that would be forbs, which are neither legumes nor cereal grains, something like flax, millet, buckwheat, crops like that. So diversity over time means that rather than monocropping wheat year after year or corn year after year, that legumes are added and forbs are added. In our particular case, it's kind of a 4-year rotation, that kind of works the best biologically. A cereal grain, an edible legume, a forb, and then a cover crop. That's kind of one of the most simplest organic rotations. The other way to do that is to add diversity in space, growing more than one crop in any given year. So we're kind of replicating a little closer, at least, the prairie ecology. In this particular case, it's an heirloom barley that we grow, grown in the same field in the same year as chickpeas. So we've got a legume and a cereal grain, and there's these symbiotic relationships that exist both above ground and below ground that reduces the need, eliminates the need for off-farm inputs. Part of the challenge of this is choosing crops that can be separated after they're harvested. Okay, because if you grow crops that are difficult to separate after, as a processor, as timeless seeds, how do we make this a marketable product? Right? When you go to the store and you buy a bag of lentils, you don't want to see wheat in that lentils. It's very difficult to sell that, or vice versa. Plus, there's all sorts of regulatory issues about what does the label say, because you can't predict how much wheat is going to be in any given 1-pound bag of lentils. So there are choices, there are challenges that come with this diverse system. It's a lot easier to talk about than to actually implement it successfully. The other way to add diversity is to think beyond the cash crop and think to the non-cash crop years, strictly a plow down year, if you will, or a cover crop year, a crop that is grown not for any immediate economic advantage, but for just a soil building advantage. And that can either be done with a standalone cover crop or one that's interseeded into the existing crop. And there's a wide variety of choices out there: annuals, biennials, perennials, can serve that purpose. And then Jeff, or I guess it was John, gave the example of Gabe Brown's place, is adding diversity within that cover crop year. In other words, having a great mix of seeds, a great mix of plants in that cover crop year. And this is something that's relatively new in the agricultural scene, but is gaining a lot of use both with organic farmers and with conventional farmers as well. Okay, so what goes up must come down. We grow a lot of this biomass, but the important part is, as has been mentioned in the previous presentations, is to get that back in the ground where the biological activity really needs the feed. That can be done with cultivation. There are advantages to that. One of the disadvantages is that there's a lot of soil disruption that happens with cultivation. Another way that works in some environments is just mowing it, laying all that biomass down onto the ground, and letting the bugs, the worms, and so forth drag it down into the ground. There's a lot less incorporation, which means a lot of the nutrients that are in that cover crop laying there, even though it's a good weed suppression, they do volatilize, especially the nitrogen volatilizes, and you lose it to the soil. And then, again, more closely mimicking the prairie ecology would be adding livestock back into that. Unfortunately, we cannot have 10,000, buffalo or cattle or hogs going from farm to farm. So there are a lot of challenges for managing that livestock to accomplish the goals of incorporating to a great degree or to a lesser degree, depending on the situation, the cover crop back into the soil. But they do have the advantage of turning that non-cash crop year, if you will, into a cash crop in the form of livestock. Okay, more eyes per acre. In the end, what it's really all about is the soil and understanding, seeing the other livestock, what I call livestock. Underground is livestock for sure. Indications that you do have a good soil. Some of it's really obvious. Earthworms, the most obvious one. Another one, another whole class are the beetles, the other arthropods that exist. And finally, the ones that you literally can't see without a microscope. That's a teaspoon of soil. In a healthy soil, there would be billions, literally billions of livestock in that soil. Okay, just the takeaway message is the future's already here. It just isn't evenly distributed. And I think that's what can be said about the soil. We've done a lot of abuse over the years. These panelists here, this whole conference, you people sitting there, our job is to distribute the future.
All right, well, I just want to thank you for your interest in soil health and for attending this workshop. And because I see soil health as really the new frontier. Why go to space? We can focus on Earth. We really haven't learned to live on this planet. And understanding the ecology of the soil and what's meant by healthy soil, I think, is a very exciting field of discovery. So appreciate, okay, the down button. And I'm going to be talking about specifically how organic agriculture relates to soil health. So talk about some of the regulatory requirements under that are captured by the standards of this seal, USDA organic. And I always like to read the definition of organic production. People still think, oh, there's 1,000 definitions. Well, no, there's one. And it's captured in the Federal Code of Regulations. Organic production, a production system, so that systems approach we've been talking about, managed to respond to site-specific conditions, so what's happening on that piece of land, by integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster the cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. That's the legal definition of organic production. That is a very holistic, ecological understanding of organic. So I just like to bring that to people's attention, that that's really what we're talking about here when we talk about organic. And this is some language from the law, not the regulation, the law that was passed in 1990, requiring chapter right there on soil fertility. An organic plan shall, not could or should, but shall contain provisions designed to foster soil fertility, primarily through the management of organic content of the soil through proper tillage, crop rotation, and manuring. So it's right there, a legal requirement passed by Congress. And then an organic plan shall not include any production or handling practices inconsistent with this chapter. And this is where I take issue with the soilless production, the hydroponic being labeled as organic, because it's something that's not benefiting the soil. It's not included under the law and should not be labeled as organic. It may be fine and good, but it's not organic. But I'll get off that soapbox. Some language from the regulation. General requirements. This is for everybody, regardless of what type of organic operation you manage, that the production practices must maintain or improve the natural resources of the operation, including soil and water quality. So once again, a must. Maintain or improve, not degrade. So you can't do organic by neglect, in other words. Producer must select and implement tillage cultivation practices, maintain or improve physical, chemical, and biological condition of the soil, and minimize soil erosion. So once again, a legal requirement here. Must manage crop nutrient, soil fertility through rotations, cover crops, and the application of plant and animal materials, such as compost. Producer must manage plant and animal materials to maintain or improve the organic matter content of the soil. And this is so important that crop rotation to organic, that it has its own section number, and I love it that it's 205.205, so it's the self-replicating rotation. Producer must implement a crop rotation, including but not limited to sod, cover crops, green manure, catch crops, provide the following functions: maintain or improve organic matter content, provide for pest management, manage deficient or excess nutrients, and provide erosion control. So rotation, soil building rotations are required and inherent. And we've heard this before. I think it's good to repeat it again because it's a fundamental principle of organic, that healthy soil leads to healthy plants, healthy animals, healthy people, and a healthy planet. And this, really goes back to Sir Albert Howard, Agricultural Testament, but then J.I. Rodale in the 1940s, first coined the phrase in the United States, organic farming. And this is kind of the banner of the Rodale Institute folks and of the organic world. But in the last few years, like the Natural Resource Conservation Service of USDA has embraced soil health, which is a very good thing. And so they have their soil health principles. And I'm going to go through what those are, and these are little modifications of those principles from the Sustainable Farming Association of Minnesota. Number one, keep the soil covered. 2, minimize soil disturbance. Increase crop diversity. Keep living roots in the soil. Integrate livestock, and that's the one that the SFA added in there that's not part of the NRCS. Those are all very positive, but there's something missing to me, and that is stop killing soil organisms. And I don't know why NRCS hasn't embraced stop doing harm to the ecology of the soil. They're talking about building soil, but you've got to you got to speak right up front what kills the soil. So it's been pointed out, the soil is just, there's more organisms, there's more species under our feet than there is above it. And organic farmers are feeding that soil using cover crops, green manures to feed the organisms itself. So that is in practice. A little scientific research summary. This is Iowa State University looking at organic versus conventional side by side and finding that after 4 years the organic yields were higher than the conventional, attributing that to higher levels of soil organic matter, enhanced microbial activity, more diverse communities of organisms in the soil. This is longer-term research out in Maryland, USDA, ARS, finding that organic farming built the soil better than conventional no-till. Even though the organic had tillage as part of it in certain times, but they were adding manure and cover crops, so they're building soil faster than a chemical no-till type system in this 10-year trials. And here's another important point. This is from University of Minnesota research, looking at water capture that you've heard about, that side by side organic plots, conventional plots with drainage, with tillage, tile drainage under them. So looking at what water is in the drainage tiles. So finding that there's like 40% less water escaping from the organic soil. So they're capturing the water, less water is going out the tile, and then the water that is going out the tiles has about 60% less nitrates. So it's cleaner water, but it's capturing that water, which water is an important part of soil health. When you have totally desiccated soil, you don't have a lot of living organisms. So we can't forget about the role of water in soil health as well. This is very similar, but even more striking results from Washington State University looking at organic orchards and finding that the conventional orchards had about 5 times the rate of nitrate leaching than the organic, and the organic having much richer communities of soil microbes as well. And this is long-term research from Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, looking at drought years. And in this 21-year trial, and probably Jeff Moyer, who will be here tonight from Rodale, can talk about this more because they've continued these trials. But in the 5 of 6 drought years during this 21-year period, the organic yields were significantly higher during those drought years. In the 6th one, it was just such a bad drought that there was a yield failure on both conventional and organic treatments. But things that kill the soil organisms, compaction. So staying off of soil, even with your feet when it's too wet. I mean, you're closing those air. And air is another important nutrient of the soil. Those organisms need air. But anhydrous ammonia, other soluble fertilizers, actually, they don't just disrupt the ecosystem, they actually kill the soil organism. So anhydrous was used, like in World War II, to make emergency landing strips. So they would spray soil with anhydrous ammonia, and it gets packed like blacktop. It's that effective in killing the soil. But herbicides, and certainly glyphosate, which, as Dr. Huber was talking this morning, it's an antimicrobial, it's a chelating agent, it kills soil organisms. Insecticides, fungicides, and GMO crops themselves. And here's, I'd like to talk, just share some our younger daughter's research. When she was in high school, her and a couple friends did a science fair project where they raised BT corn and non-BT corn in 5-gallon buckets. And when the corn, before it tasseled, we didn't want the pollen flying around our organic farm, they pulled up and dried all the plant material, including the roots, and tested it to confirm the presence of the BT trait in the corn residues, then mixed those with earthworm bedding in replicated chambers with 5 night crawlers per chamber. And they were in our root cellar and, dark and cool. On a weekly basis, the girls would take the worms out and weigh them and do a health check. And consistently, the ones in the BT corn residue had ugly lesions and died. Consistently. The ones with the non-BT were just fat and sassy night crawlers. It's like, want to go fishing. They went all the way and got a second place at the International Science Fair with this. But what are the researchers looking at the impact of the BT toxin on the soil ecology? I don't think very much. And this really raised my eyes that there's things that need further research. So we've also got, all these weeds that have developed resistance to glyphosate, to Roundup. So here, 2006, this area, North Dakota, Minnesota, very few incidents of resistance being found. But by 2013, all over the place. And it's the further south you go in the United States, the worse the situation is. So the response has been to apply more Roundup and then more other herbicides. Rotate your herbicides, don't rotate your crops, is the advice. And a really good paper put out by the Soil Association in Great Britain last year on the impact of glyphosate on soil health and the evidence to date. It summarizes 66 different published research. I'm not going to go into detail, but I do encourage you to download that and take a look, because it's all well cited there. But the organic farming practices with the soil building crop rotations, like I talked about, that are required. The cover crops, use of manure, are also sequestering carbon, so capturing carbon, which is an energy source in the soil. And here is a kind of mega study looking at 74 different comparisons, finding consistently that organic farm soils increase the soil organic carbon concentrations and have superior sequestration rates than non-organic management. And this goes back to the Rodale study. Here, treatment using conventional, and you see essentially the level of soil organic carbon staying flat, and using legumes or animal manure, that the level just continues to increase over time. So I will close there. And a little different image here for you. Nothing to do with the soil, but just a big smile. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, we have some time for questions, and I'm going to give this mic to the speakers, and you can pose your question to them, but I'm going to go around with this. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good idea. And I'll go around, and you can speak into this mic. I'll start at the front.
Okay. And you have to speak up so we can all hear you, or we repeat it.
Okay. Am I coming across?
Yeah,
okay.
but it's not amplified. This is just for the recording. So this is, it's
Oh,
kind of like a
okay.
toy microphone.
Okay. No wonder. Okay, so for me, there seems to be an earthworm controversy. Not only that they're an invasive species in the sense of forestry, but I've always been so happy seeing them wiggling around in my organic, little gardens. And so I would like to hear from experts regarding how you relate to earthworms.
Well, the earthworm that you're talking about is one that's been imported, and it comes from Asia. It looks like our earthworms. All earthworms in the United States have been imported. Let me back up. They were wiped out by the glaciers. Some down in Arizona lived, and up in northern Alaska. But so the Pilgrims came. They brought in the good earthworms, and then Johnny Appleseed and Oregon Trail, blah, blah. So they came to Anchorage, Alaska about 25 years ago. We didn't have any earthworms up there. People ask me, what are those little things in my lawn? I have to say, keep them. The deal is that they brought in these Asian worms. These Asian worms wiggle faster. They have a different little saddle around them. And when the fisherman drops them down on the ground, they take down the duff faster than our regular earthworms do. So instead of 2 years for the duff to go away, it goes down in 6 months. In comes the mustard seed. The mustard plants grow. They put out a allopathic chemical that kills the mycorrhizal fungi, so that you can't grow maple trees in Minnesota. That's what happens. It's an imported worm. The regular earthworms don't cause the problem. So you have to know the difference between the bad worms and the good worms. There's all sorts of stuff on Google that'll tell you how to do it. It's not difficult, but you got to go look it up. Information is power. Look at Google. It'll tell you exactly how to do it. Earthworms are fabulous. What goes through an earthworm and comes out the other end are two different things, so it concentrates the nutrients, unbelievable numbers, 10 times more phosphate, 7 times, blah, 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 blah. And so that's why vermicompost is so great. Don't give up on it. Just don't use bad earthworms.
So like if I'm going to set up a vermicomposting system, and red wigglers are what you should be buying, right? Those are not the imported ones. So yeah. I for a couple years I had a vermicomposter, but then I had left it in the garage and had it wrapped up, but it got way too cold and I lost it and I haven't reestablished. But I encourage people to play around with that.
This is for David. I wanted to know if you use inoculants on the lentils, if they require that.
Yeah, and that's a great question. We do add rhizobia inoculant, that symbiotic bacteria that helps the legumes fix nitrogen. The legumes, the pulse crops, peas, lentils, chickpeas, dry beans, none of those are indigenous to, native to the northern Great Plains, or to North America actually, except for some beans are. But so the rhizobia, is not there naturally. That's correct. And there's some studies that indicate, if a person does rotations, regularly, get 2 or 3 times through the rotations, the rhizobia will survive in the soil, and the person does not need to add that as a seed treatment. On the other hand, it's really cheap insurance, to do that. It might be $2, $4, up to maybe $15, $20 an acre if that. Inoculant also includes some mycorrhiza fungi as well, but short answer is yes, we do, and totally recommend it.
Maybe Jeff could comment on the different relationships.
Well, yeah, the both of the rhizobia and the mycorrhizal fungi are activated by a signal that's sent from the plant. So the plant's doing the initiation. If you give the plant too much food, synthetic fertilizers, it doesn't need to send the signal out, and so it doesn't. So you want to make sure that you're keeping your fertilizers organic, obviously, and you want to keep the phosphate and nitrogen numbers a little bit lower than you normally would, because if you're giving it to them, they don't need to associate with the mycorrhizal fungi to go out and get it, or with the nitrogen fixating bacteria. The mycorrhizal fungi turns out to increase the number of nodules you get with the nitrogen fixation. So there's something going on there that's sort of like a triple symbiotic situation. So they're both very important. But you got to watch the nitrogen, and manure, can contain a lot of stuff that'll prevent the plant from doing what it needs to do because it's very rich. So.
Yes, we're in northern Wisconsin. We have about a 30-year continuous sod that we're operating on. We're grass finishing our cattle on that. We spread manure on it periodically. Is there anything else? We're gaining organic matter. We know that. Is there anything else I can do, or is that about all we can do to enhance the microbes in the soil and keep the organic matter growing?
Bale grazing.
Pardon?
Bale grazing. Are you doing that? Bale grazing. So you're going to take your winter feed, your hay, and you're going to feed it on pasture. Are you? Yeah.
A lot of wolves. And the other one is, you have more? Yeah, well, I guess answer. One is that we have wolves. The other is we have a water problem. When I winter graze those bales, I'm overloading manure on a smaller acre because it's hard to get water to them in the winter when it's 20 below zero, and everybody is, doing other things. We all work off the farm too. So we keep that up as long as we can, but by January, my wife is real tired about 150 foot of hose trying to get water that freezes every night up and drain that hose. So we can't go any farther. And again, those fields that we can get that long hose to are getting overloaded. So we try not to stay much past January, or we're probably overloading that with nitrogen.
One thing that I would encourage you to play with in your as you rotate the animals around, if you feel like you're getting an overload of nutrients, you might leave. This is not gonna make intuitive sense when you first think about this. Don't graze them as long in that spot, even though there's a lot there, and you think, well, we're overloading nutrients, we're getting a lot of grass. Don't take it all and leave more of it behind. Take them off before they eat it all. And what that is going to do, it's going to take some time, but that extra biomass, as it recycles, will enhance and grow more of the soil biology that's going to process that nutrient. So it's not really intuitive, because most people that are grazing cattle are thinking we want to take as much of it as we can. And in fact, you want to take the least that you can and leave it for the soil bacteria, the soil microbes to feed them. The next time through, and as that cycles through again and again and again, you will take the same amount of grass each time, but you'll be doing it with more and more and more cattle. And that's how you're going to increase the productivity.
Do you have dung beetles?
This question's for David. So I'm actually up in Williston, North Dakota, so semi-arid applies to where I am too. And I would like to hear a little bit more about your companion cropping. So what species do you like to do together? And then in terms of rates, are you doing a full seeding rate of both species, or do you cut back on one or another?
Yeah, companion cropping during the cash crop year. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yep. Typically we like to include a legume, obviously for the biological nitrogen, and the slide you saw there was a cereal grain, barley and chickpea. Another combination that works fairly well was lentils and flax, just because they are easy to separate. As a processor, our biggest weed, organic processor, people are always concerned about weeds, and our biggest weed for our lentil growers is wheat, because it's difficult to separate, and wheat is king. So there's always volunteer wheat in the field. So we actually spend a lot of money getting rid of wheat. There's a lot of things to consider for companion cropping. One is, if you want to seed it in the same pass, you're going to want crops that needed to be seeded at basically the same seeding depth, right? If you seed a very small seed too deep, it probably won't emerge. And then the other thing is timing of harvest. Okay, because if you have one ripe, and one still green, that'll cause a lot of mayhem during harvest as well. So it takes a lot of, kind of school of hard knocks experience actually to figure out, what's going to work in your particular environment and the particular varieties that you seed. NDSU has done some pretty good work a number of years back, actually, maybe a decade or so ago, about companion cropping, flax and lentils and other crops. So check out with the Carrington Station and see what they'd recommend.
I just wanted to question, if the lentils that you plant, are they open pollinated? You saving your own seed, or your farmers?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there's not been a lot of breeding work done.
No, that's the beauty actually of these pulse crops, that they're new enough and it's still small enough acreage that Monsanto or some of these big guys have not kind of locked them up or done kind of excessive breeding on them. But so far none of them are GMO'd, and all of them are not all of them are public varieties currently actually, but a farmer can pretty much save and plant at least his own seed. But the crops that we use obviously are definitely open. Yep.
Get it on the recording.
I'm sorry.
One more time.
Northern Plains Sustainable Ag Society is a really active farm breeders club, and they're doing some work with lentils, small grains, cowpeas, so they could be another good resource to find seed.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Go back to where'd Liz go?
I have a question for John. I don't know that much about your story. I know more about your recent work, but I'm really curious reading your bio about the arc of your career and how basically the first part of your career has informed this part of your career for those of us who haven't been inside the world that you've been inside.
Okay, I don't know how much time we have. So I grew up on a farm and went away to college and studied agriculture at a major Midwestern university steeped in conventional ag. learned how to, for the first time I learned there, this is unrelated to agronomy, but it's there where I learned you have to borrow money in the spring to buy all your inputs. The farm I grew up on, we didn't do that. And I, so naive at 18 years old, going to college and learning that that's how everybody did it, you know. Everybody, the first thing it taught us in the first Ag Econ class was how to prepare a bank statement and sit down with your banker. I was like, we didn't borrow any money. Anyways, so I worked in agriculture, in conventional agriculture for many years, actually, both in Cooperative Extension Service and then also worked for Dow Chemical for 6 years. Started out with Mycogen Seeds, which was actually, you never hear that name, but they actually won a lawsuit against Monsanto in the biotech arena as the very first patented biotech gene inserted into corn. And I worked there, and it was a very exciting time to be working in the mid-90s in retailing GMO technology to farmers. Everybody wanted to talk to you if you had the right cap on your head. It was very, very exciting. Researchers from every university coming to me as the local agronomist, trying to get product so they could put it in their test plots because they didn't want to be left out. I could tell you lots of stories about university research and how excited they were to have our product in their fields. In the late 90s, we ran into some issues in the work that I was working. Had now moved into the corporate headquarters in Indianapolis, and we had an issue with Starlink. Does anybody remember Starlink? Starlink was a herbicide resistance genetic modification that was this was crazy. This was approved for use in corn that was to be fed for livestock only. So there was this EPA approved this, but they said only for livestock consumption. In other words, they made the farmers sign a piece of paper when they bought the seed saying that they promise they'll never sell the corn that's produced into the human food chain, only to someone who's raising livestock or into the livestock feed chain. If you've grown up on any farm at all, you know that nobody took that seriously. Not a single farmer took it seriously. And practically, it's very difficult, especially at the time in the early, mid to late 90s when the idea of keeping different crops separate from each other wasn't an issue, right? So all of this went in the human food chain in one way or another. Long story short, somebody bought some Taco Bell corn chips in a grocery store and got sick and tied this to the Starlink gene that was in that corn. That was not our technology. That was owned by a competitive company to the one that I worked for. But that gene showed up in our product. Because what most people don't realize is that really all of the seed corn is produced in a very small area in central Iowa. And the pollen drifts among the seed corn companies' production fields. And so every seed company in the whole United States had Starlink in their material, even though it was patented and owned by Aventis only. And the project that I ended up working on was how are we going to get rid of all of this seed now that is contaminated with a gene that we don't own, and so we couldn't sell it legally. And now it was banned because of the problem that the corn chips created. So that was a project. We lost millions of dollars on that as a company. The whole seed industry was upset, and this company went out of business that produced this. Shortly after that, okay, this was an issue of pollen drift that caused this Aventis outbreak. Shortly after that, I was sitting in a meeting of the top researchers, and they were talking about the latest, greatest biotechnology traits coming down the pipe. What's coming in biotech, how are we going to use it in corn, and how much money is it going to make for the company. And so it's listing all these traits, and we get down to the bottom, and the person at the front of the room says, and we're really excited about our latest joint venture with Epicite Pharmaceuticals. They've discovered an anti-sperm gene, and we're going to put it in corn. And there's a room about this many people in the room. Somebody in the back goes, well, what will we use that for? I think the rest of us were shocked. I mean, I was like, well, I can't believe this. And without missing a beat, the presenter said, well, population control in third world countries. And so this is about 9 o'clock in the morning. And by noon, I had an interview with another organization because I couldn't tolerate working in that environment. I didn't feel like that was the best use of my talents. And so I went to work in Extension, and about simultaneously we started hobby farming at the time, growing our own food and helping to support our family as we were going through some food allergy issues at the time. And so that one thing led to another. We had a hard time finding good food to feed our family in the late 90s. And we made a decision that we were going to become farmers. And so we left a good job in the city. And about 11 years ago, we started farming and raising grass-fed beef. And I've been working in nonprofit organizations for the last 9 years or so, 8 years, I guess, to help spread the information and knowledge and encouragement and inspiration to others who want to do the same.
So I wanted to address consumer economic activism, because I think consumer economic activism, and so when you said about diversity crops, I'm like, man, lentils, and can I buy those together? Because if I bought the lentils and the flaxseed together, or if I had some really good recipes, that might be affordable, healthy, organic food. So how do we create this economic kingdom?
Yeah, you know, in the chef's world, there is the concept of eating the whole animal, right? And this is basically what you're asking about on the plant side. It's a great concept. There are some technical difficulties, and there are some labeling and regulatory difficulties, for basically harvesting various crops together, cleaning them both to food grade specifications, putting them, in a package or in a format that not only you, right, but your neighbor and 10,000 or 10 million other people would also say, "Oh yeah, I get this." It's kind of a cultural shift, I think, that would be helpful if it could happen. Doesn't really answer your question, but it's complicated. Yeah.
Just to add another comment to that, because as I mentioned, that the rotation is essential, and you can always sell those, the soybeans, the corn, the lentils, if you put the work into it, to build the markets. But the other rotational crops, that's where we need more companies to commit resources to developing products to utilize these. And that one thing I'm really excited about at the University of Minnesota has this Forever Green initiative. Dr. Don Wise is heading that up. And that's exactly the focus, is perennializing the landscape, but then identifying, and developing markets for these new crops. And primarily focus on perennials in this instance, but I know like General Mills has launched a transition payment system to help conventional farmers convert, and they aren't just focusing on those traditional cash crops, but they're supporting the whole rotation. And I think you're right on that. That's exactly what we need from both the buyers, but also the research is to support the whole system to really make it work. And to understand that that's part of the cost of the cash crop that an organic farmer sells is the year that was spent investing in the soil with your green manures and cover crops that aren't getting an immediate cash return, but they're getting a return in terms of higher nutrition, higher quality, less pests, all those intangibles, but we need to factor that in both buyers and government policies as well.
Yeah, and just add something that if you remember the slide last night that I had about annual per capita consumption, wheat was 170 pounds, right? Lentils were 10 ounces, less than a pound. Farmers will grow what people eat. Okay, when you talk about connecting the dots, if consumers want, a more regenerative agriculture, a more sustainable crop rotation, you vote with your dollar. That was said, and it's easy to say, well, people should grow more lentils because they build the soil, does all these great things, saves the planet, But if you don't eat lentils, or whatever it is, you don't eat flax, you don't eat whatever it is, there's no reason to grow it. Yep.
My question maybe relates to John's story, and how do you cross-pollinate, to say, between the practices that you incorporate into what you do and in talking to conventional farmers and just getting more farmers to farm like you do?
Well, that's a great question. It's something that I think we really need to focus on, because the people that are in the room here and the people that are already organic farmers are the ones who probably didn't need a whole bunch of encouragement to go there. They had something in their family or something in their life that motivated them to do that. But how do you take somebody who's making an okay living doing a conventional farming operation? How do you convince them? There's a lot of angst and concern about how conventional ag companies like Monsanto have started to use the term sustainable. They've started to co-opt the language a little bit. They've created some confusion about what that really means and all that. That's one of the reasons why the organic standard is so important, because it's very clear what organic means. And so we want to hang on to that. But I would say I would welcome that discussion. I would say to a conventional farmer who says, well, I'm sustainable, what's the difference? I would welcome that conversation, because I would want to find out, what do they think sustainability means? What are they doing? The slide I didn't show, American Soybean Association puts out an advertisement that says reduce tillage. And then below it says, if you farm using reduced tillage, you are sustainable. At the University of Minnesota football games in the fall, they always have an advertisement. Somebody who's a farmer says, we rotate between corn and soybeans. We're sustainable. Okay, well, that's good. That's step one. That's a baby step, right? So I would invite them to take the next step. Well, tell me about, is there any other thing you could rotate in there? I think we're expecting too much when we say to somebody, you need to go from a corn-soybean rotation that is cookie cutter recipe. You call up the spray applicator, they come out and spray it. You don't even know or care really what they're spraying, because they're going to guarantee you don't have any weeds. It's a recipe that somebody else, not maybe even a family member, a hired employee, is doing the tillage, doing the work. It's hard to say to that person, you need to become organic and do what Jim is talking about, have a system that encapsulates all the things we're talking about, and say, oh, and by the way, you're going to run your business like that. It's very difficult. We have to bring people along gradually. It's very challenging to assume that they're going to do that. And the other thing I would say, and not to go on and on, but this is an important point that doesn't get mentioned. There is a culture in conventional agriculture among farmers and expert and input supply experts. There's a culture of camaraderie. There's a culture of partnership. And it is all about relationships at the end of the day. And you've talked to somebody that says, I've talked to conventional farmers say, I'd really like to try to do more organic. I like the price premium, or I don't like relying on all the inputs from XYZ company, but I'm concerned what my neighbors are going to say. I don't want to be the one who's different. Well, now, that's not really any different than any of us, right? I mean, we all have that issue in our lives. I mean, I've got a couple one teenager now. That's an issue, right? It's something that we think about, is what are people going to think if I do that? Well, that sentiment is really strong in the conventional farming world because it's cultivated. That is something that's developed between input suppliers, experts, university, the farm media, the farm press, big part in that as well. Yeah, that's right.
You can take to the bank.
That's right.
So I work in California, and so it's not a whole lot of corn and soybeans. But one of the primary focuses of the pesticide reform movement in California has been soil fumigants, which are, clearly the opposite of soil health. The idea is to, make the soil into just a substrate rather than a living thing. One primary focus has been on strawberries. And so the issue is there are very successful organic growers who grow strawberries in California, and the biggest strawberry grower in California has a really healthy organic, sector. But the organic production of strawberries relies on a pretty long crop rotation. They're talking 5 years. And most of those other crops, it's not just that they're less profitable than strawberries, but they're, way less profitable than, strawberries are just such a high value crop. And the argument is that for small farmers, it's really hard for them to switch from growing a crop that has a consistent high value to a rotation system where you have the high value and then low value years. And I just would love your comments about this.
Just the other day I read an article, what they're starting to do with organic and even conventional growing of strawberries in California is trough growing. So they're raised above the ground. They determined, this is an economic issue, not an environmental issue, that the pickers could pick 3 times as much if they raised them up off the ground. So now they've raised them up off the ground, which lets the farmer, instead of using soil, for example, although that's probably the best thing to use, they can use coir, coconut coir. So they don't have to use this fumigant, which only California uses, methyl bromide. We're the only country in the world that's allowed to use methyl bromide. It's been extended, 4 times? The ability to it's crazy, absolutely crazy. So there are new methods that are coming. People are aware of it. Obviously, methyl bromide is going to go away. And all of those strawberry farmers know it. Now, they maybe got a little reprieve with this idiot we just appointed for, EPA, but, and the idiot president who appointed him. But after 4 years, methyl bromide's going to go away. And so they've got to develop the new systems, and they're doing it. But they're not doing it fast enough. So in the meantime, we got to vote with our pocketbook. The other thing that's going on in California is they're growing weed, cannabis. And so they're figuring out how to grow things without herbicides and pesticides because you can't sell the cannabis with a pesticide on it. So all sorts of stuff are happening in California. You're going to see a rapid change, I think, in the next 3 or 4 years. But
okay. Thank you. I think we're going to have to wrap up now. I think we go to lunch now. Thank you guys.